David, you promised to tell a story.
So I can tell you the story if you like. Would you like to hear the story?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the story is, who is David Stirling? Well, that's me, of course. But if you go to Google and you type in David Stirling, you're more likely to bring up the name of the founder of the SAS regiment, the famous British soldier, Colonel Archibald David Stirling, who became known as the Phantom Major. He operated in North Africa during the Second World War, and he founded this very famous British elite soldier regiment. Basically, the idea was to go long distances across the desert and to sneak behind enemy lines and to cause a lot of destruction and disruption to things like airfields, aeroplanes, fuel dumps, to go in undetected and then to sneak out and to plant these small bombs and to blow things up and then to get out with these long routes across the desert. And the idea that they could cause as much damage as, a whole army unit could, but they would have much less. It would cost much less for starters, and ideally there'd be less loss of life. He was a real character, this David Stirling. He came from a Scottish family. He had quite a privileged background. He was an artist in his early life, but he didn't quite succeed at that because he didn't have the drawing skills, but he did have the very creative mind. He was a very adventurous guy. He'd got into mountain climbing. He went into Canada at the time of the war. He was being a cowboy. He was living with native Indian people. And then suddenly he was called back to the UK. The war was starting and he trained with Commandos. But he got quite bored by the normal soldiers training. He was always looking to be excellent, to do something different. And there's a great story about how he had this idea and how he knew he needed to tell it to the important generals and the people at the top, the top brass. So the story goes that he jumped out of an aeroplane. He volunteered for some parachuting practice, but he'd injured himself and broken his leg. So he was on crutches, and he'd approached the headquarters of the army, and he tried to bluff his way in. He tried to tell a story to get in, but the guard didn't believe him. He said, "Do you have an appointment with the general?" No, he didn't have an appointment. So he had to hobble off, and then he sneaked in through the side, through a gap in the wall, and tried to get in, but somebody saw him and he ran. He had to run away on his crutches, and he was in a lot of pain, and he burst into this door, into this room. But it turned out this major behind in this first room was somebody that he had the terrible relationship with, and he'd already had some problem with. So he had to run away from him and find the top guy that he wanted to tell his story to. And apparently he did find this high general. And the general said, "Okay, there may be some merit in your plan, your proposal." So he was allowed to start this. He was very successful in the war, even though he did get captured. He was captured by the Germans at one point and taken to one of their top security prisons called Colditz, quite a famous castle, which was served as a prison in the war. But he had two really important people that worked with him, and they set up the idea of this small elite service, elite group of soldiers that could train and could, be very effective. And it's still the SAS, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's still in service to this day, and it's had some kind of famous operations. I think after the war, this guy was not able to be so successful, maybe because during the wartime, he could really be creative. He could go on these daring missions, and he was someone who always volunteered for the operations himself. He didn't just tell his men what to do. He would go through the training himself. So he led by example, and I think he was a brave guy, creative, quite entrepreneurial. But after the war, he tried various things, but he never really got this same level of success. And he did have a bit of a gambling problem and drinking, and he got involved in some controversial things. So he is a bit of a controversial figure. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because, well, it's storytelling session today. So I thought I would tell you the story about my namesake and who he is. And I think although he's a flawed character, like all heroes, none of us are perfect, but he has a lot of admirable characteristics. So we can learn from him and take the good and maybe avoid the bad. Try to use that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for listening.